Greetings, everyone. I think I've got noon, and so we're going to go ahead and get started with our last and fourth session. Hope everyone's had a chance, at least if you're here on the East Coast, to grab your lunch and are ready to hear a little bit about the current state of blockchain and where the future of it is heading. We're really excited for our noon keynote to have Wendy Henry from Deloitte Consulting. She will be giving us a talk a little bit about some of the work that they're doing and also more broadly about just kind of blockchain in general and holding up a couple of use cases. So I'm really excited to hear her talk. Wendy is the managing director and the blockchain lead for Deloitte's Government and Public Service Union. And I was really excited to see that she was recently named one of the 10 most notable women in blockchain. So congratulations, Wendy. And I'm sure that that's quite an exciting title there for you. And we're really excited for your talk. So with that, I'll go ahead and let you take it away. And this session will have a little bit of a keynote, and then we'll have some questions. So be on the lookout for the chat and put some in there. And with that, I'll let you take it away, Wendy. Thanks.
I'm really excited about being here today. I've gotten the chance to listen to a couple of the other speakers, and there's been such incredible content. And certainly, you know, I have been in and around blockchain since 2012. So I've been in it for a while, not quite at the beginning. But the interesting part has been that I've actually been able to watch it as it has progressed. And so some of the comments and things we've talked about today on the conference have been super, super interesting. One of the things I'm going to do is look at a little bit of where we're at today, and then, you know, what do things look like as we start to look towards the future of blockchain, but also more broadly, because I like to say blockchain's one flavor of distributed ledger technology. What Deloitte has been doing for the last 3 years in and around blockchain, we've been working with blockchain since 2011, 2012 in earnest. But for the past couple of years, we've actually run a survey that has been distributed out across 14 different countries globally, has around 1,500 respondents. And the respondents are executives who have a clear line of sight to decision making in their companies. And I wanted to share just a couple of the things that we heard this past year on the survey. We were just starting to enter into COVID as we got the responses back in for this. So, you know, there's definitely been some turbulence and some exciting changes as a result of the pandemic. But, you know, what was most notable was, if you look at it, we really started to see that there were the majority of the survey respondents who indicated that blockchain or some type of DLT, they did believe would be critical and relevant and was actually going to be a top strategic priority. And that was up pretty significantly or statistically significantly from the prior year. We also saw that many more of the respondents saw a compelling business use case. And what that says is that people are starting to really understand how the technology can start to drive value. I think, you know, we heard, you know, definitely from Colonel Regenor that, you know, that we aren't going to be really talking about blockchain so much as the technology, because it really is a foundational component that just allows us to do something differently. But what we are seeing is that a lot of people have been able to get their head around what are those new types of functions? What is that new value that can be driven through the use of this technology that we couldn't do before? And that's bearing out in organizations really starting to see compelling business use cases. There's still going to be challenges in bringing those to market and really getting them up in a production sense. But we're starting to move in that direction, which is greatness. I think what they're seeing is that this technology has the potential to be a true agent of change, right? And that's what they're really looking for as they start to explore the technology more fully in those use cases. Interestingly enough, also 89% of the survey responses, so that 88 is there too, but 89% of the survey responses indicated that they thought digital assets, right? And we've seen a real strong move towards digital assets and a compelling business use case for them across many different fronts. It's really accelerated even in just the past 12 months. So where are we seeing some prevalent use cases? I think, this is just a real smattering of where we're starting to see them. Interestingly, there were multiple voting platforms that were out there and had been tested prior to this past election. But I think everything went pretty quiet with how new the technology was, and some of the news around would even vote by mail be, or mail-in ballots be accepted. I think we're going to see an uptick in some of these conversations as we move forward. When we think of blockchain as really truly being this tamper evident, verifiable single source of the truth, right, where information can be shared with parties in a sense of transparency that we don't normally see. I think voting is definitely one of those that, with certain challenges that are still out there being solved more quickly, this technology would really be applied. And as I said, there are operational systems out there. West Virginia has done trials with them. Colorado has done trials. So a lot of there have been active use of these technologies in some elections throughout the US already. We also see, when we think about where does blockchain fit, we really think, there's recordation, there's transfer of value, and that recordation, I think we're starting to see a little bit more. And we'll get into, across all of these, when we talk about voting, we talk about just that recordation, whether it's title, transfer, and protection, any of these, what we're going to begin to see is that there's a long pole in the tent, and that's got to do with identity. And I'll talk about that a little bit more a little later in the presentation. Where we've seen a significant uptick just as a result of the pandemic is, and I know there was an earlier session on this, and that is in patient data, especially around what's considered these vaccination passports. And I know there was also talk about the political nature surrounding those. But the fact of the matter is there are probably 27 products in market right now in various stages of maturity. They're spanning from states, which New York State released the Excelsior Pass, which is not mandatory. It is voluntary to be used, but it is there. Down to we're seeing things like IATA coming to market with something in the travel industry. We see the Green Pass coming out of the EU, where in an effort to try and open economies and open borders, right, they are using these digital health passes. And there are a good number of them that are using blockchain at varying degrees of integration into these solutions. And I think that's another thing as we look across all of these currently active use cases, that in many cases, blockchain is not the only solution, it is the additive. And so we think of it in some ways as an and technology. You just had a great talk on supply chain and the use of the technology across that. And then, as we said, we're starting to see digital assets really start to explode with DeFi and NFT, and we'll talk about some of that coming up as well. So when we talk about this, there's three places that I'd love to talk about as we think how this technology can and will transform industries. I think one of the big ones, which I've alluded to across several of the conversations, has really been around this whole digital assets, be that DeFi, be that NFT, be that stable coins. be that, just some of the digital representations that are being attributed, even as we think about supply chain and supply chain parts. The second thing is, how is industry using this to really improve their processes, to drive value, to increase profit, to open new markets that haven't been there in the past without this technology. And so we'll kind of explore a little bit around that. And then finally, as I said, and we've seen, definite motion acceleration here just in the last, 12 months during the pandemic on this sovereign identity. And a lot of that is being driven off of the need for these, what we'll call passports, right? Health passports. So let's dive just a little bit deeper into some of these other components, right? So when we talk about digital assets, and I know right now that, we're thinking DeFi, we're thinking NFTs, because that's what's sort of just being blasted into the media at the moment. But really, a digital asset is anything that can be represented in a digital form that holds intrinsic or acquired value, right? And so there's much that goes beyond just NFTs or DeFis. The blockchain does give us the capability to sort of assign that digital uniqueness to that digital asset in a better form. It's not perfect, and there are definitely times where an air gap still exists. I think we're getting better in understanding how to handle that air gap. But when you talk about some of the early cases of sort of putting something on the blockchain as a digital asset, you think of things like a coffee bean, like something out of a farm, right? And you start to kind of scratch your head on how do you really make sure that the asset that you're tagging is the asset that is actually being reported on as it travels across its entire supply chain. And so everything isn't quite being solved yet. I did hear about, the digital dust and gold dust, and I think there are some intriguing new ways that we're starting to do that. But there are just a lot to digital assets that go well beyond what we're thinking about today when we start thinking about financial instruments. However, those are, really what is top of mind right now when we talk about digital assets. I think we're also seeing a lot with central bank digital currency. I think that is, as we look, China is definitely out in front of the game there, but the U.S. is looking at it. We're not as vociferous about it. We're not, as far along in jumping in with both feet. But CDBCs are I don't ever get that acronym right, but central bank digital currencies are definitely coming along. What's interesting to note is that not all of them are using a blockchain. So I know those two get equated to one another quite frequently, but there's actually a lot of implementations that are happening right now that are not blockchain based. But let's move on to DeFi. I know that there was also some conversation around that in some of the earlier talks that you've had or panel presentations. And with DeFi, what's really happening there is that it's allowing banking type of transactions and even insurance, right? Investment transactions. The thought is that this starts to happen without that intermediary there, without the bank, right? You're directly sort of engaging in the marketplace that you want to engage in without that intermediary. I think what's important, as this thing is running at 1 million miles a minute, and it truly is, there's a couple of things that I would just say to deeper dive on. Number one, some of the most, so a lot of it is equated to Ethereum because of the smart contracts and the ability to do the tokens, et cetera. But if you look at it, due to the cost, right, and we've all seen Ether go through the roof, which is good for those of you that bought it when it was very inexpensive. But the cost of these transactions and your ability to recoup the full cost of what it is you're doing, you need to think about that, right? And some of that, what we're seeing is that more of the DeFi marketplaces that are getting the most traction are actually non-Ethereum based. So just something to take a look at and kind of drill into a little bit if you're getting hot and heavy into that DeFi market. And if you are, you probably know about it. But total interesting things happening as DeFi really does challenge the status quo and offers people ways to transact directly with one another in a truly democratic and decentralized way. Proof will be in the pudding on how this plays out, and we're going to talk a little bit about regulatory components here in just a moment, but it's an exciting time and an exciting marketplace that we're starting to see the maturation of the technology, both on scale and interoperability at such a level that these kinds of things are now doable. And NFTs, non-fungible tokens, I'm sure, I think I heard conversation about that a little bit earlier today. And really those are uniquely identifiable and tradable digital representations of something, right? Mostly where we see it, and I know it's heavy in the US, it's not as heavy outside of the US right now, but it has a lot to do in a royalty economy, right, is where we're starting to see it to begin with. And that's why we're seeing, the tweets. Jack Dorsey sold his first ever tweet for $2.9 million. Glad someone has something like that to spend on a tweet. Down to, just people actually creating their own NFTs from art or, a song or something. And some of those are artists, and some of them are, known artists, and others are able to actually create stuff and put it out into a marketplace that they're able to sell it. I think the cool thing that I heard, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they were talking about NFTs, and the obvious is these marketplaces that are existing right now for art and audio and other things. But I really loved it when I heard, and this applies to many of you on the phone, is, what about for textbooks, right? Today, the price of textbooks are high because they're sold once and used many times. But if you could put a unique fingerprint on them such that they can't be resold, except if the royalty goes back to the originating writer, so the publishing house, right? Could the price of textbooks be much lower, and the publishing house gets the actual due to them on the multiple resells? So I think when you start to think of it that way, there are some just a much broader landscape of where NFTs can in fact start to bring real value to industry. So those are just a couple of thoughts on the digital assets. And I feel badly because I'm just talking at you. So I see that some of the questions are coming up in the chat. Okay, some people put some of the voting up there. So really good. Yep, those would be great to look at. Okay, so we see all kinds of places. And the cool thing about my role has been that I've been able to work with government, but I've also been able to work in commercial industry. And the learning is in the doing. And I've actually been able to be part of great teams who have built systems that are blockchain-based systems. And they have spawned all of these, from agriculture with looking at how do you track either dairy outputs from dairy farms, to beef on the blockchain, worked with a great group out of Wyoming on that, to, logistics. We're seeing a lot in logistics around, especially in two of the cooler cases that we've just recently built some systems for was, and this kind of also plays on what Colonel Regenor said. We built one where there were sensors on the airplane, and to his point that it costs a lot of money for these airlines if, number one, they don't know of the problem before the plane lands, and two, if they don't have the adequate supplies and or right technicians. And so we built a system that allowed sensors on various high failure components on a plane to actually record their health, if you will, during any given flight. And if something went into alarm based on thresholds, it was able to send that to the ground, open a trouble ticket, so open a ticket into their ticketing system, so that they then were able to meet the plane with potential parts and replacements. There was a lot of diagnostics that were sent if something went into alarm, and they were able to, more quickly and efficiently address issues after the plane came, landed, such that they could get that plane back in the air and or know they needed to replace the aircraft in a much quicker turnaround. So there are, just incredible uses when we start to blend the technologies, and that's why I call it an and technology. I think of, blockchain or distributed ledger technology as being that sort of connective tissue, if you will, and then allowing, sensors, definitely the use of AI, ML, to help understand the data and how to react to that, to drive outcomes that can be very, very useful and very proactive as opposed to reactive for a lot of these industries. And agriculture is another one. With some of the farming and the wastewater collection, and then the ability to release that back into the environment, being able to stipulate thresholds, again, use sensors, know when that water has been cleaned to the level that it can then be released back into the environment, is another place where IoT and ML came together. I won't belabor the healthcare. I know you guys have heard a lot of that. And so some of those obvious use cases, a lot of people dove into with greatness earlier today. And then finally, the government is starting to look at this and look at this hard. They've been a little slower out of the gates, but, everything from one of the, cooler implementations is almost in a command and control, and the sharing of data through the Intel community, where, different Intel organizations in different global, areas can in fact have data that they then can share to do what they call, say, left of boom, right? So in the use of weapons of mass destruction, there are certain dual use devices and chemicals that manufacturers, just industry in general, will get requests for quote on that seem a little bit off. And the ability with blockchain to, and again, using stuff like natural language processing and AI and ML, the ability to, parse those requests, those in an unstructured format, be able to pull data out, be able to, use smart contracts to look across threat fronts and interact with oracles, which are data sources outside of the blockchain, to be able to flag this, which today is being done manually, and then be able to triangulate and share across different governments while not sharing a lot of the PII or citizen-specific information is really changing the landscape on the way that intel communities can interact with one another. So there's all kinds of government cases that are out there as well that they're now be able to look at grants management, right? Near and dear to any educational institution, you know, the ability to tokenize as a non-fungible token, as a matter of fact, letters of credit for grants, be able to color the money, if you will. So portions of the grants can only be used for travel, or can only be used, you know, for research, or can only be used for sub-grant recipients, right? And then being able to, you know that, reduce that reporting burden, and yet know that the grant was executed according to the conditions, is also another place where government is looking and exploring the use of blockchain technology. So that was a lot, but I'm trying to stay on track here. So self-sovereign identity is really the third place that I think we're going to start to see quite a bit of motion, and we're already starting to see that with these health passports. Right now, we're not totally in control of our identity, and there is no centralized identity that can really say we are exactly who we say we are. We saw that with driver's licenses. We're coming out with Real ID. But there needs to be a mechanism by which you can, in fact, say you are who you say you are, right? And that biometrics has come a long way, but bringing that all together and allowing that to be connected to you so that you can then control the data that you share about you without letting others have that control is something we call self-sovereign identity. And a lot of it's trying to change to user-controlled identity versus self-sovereign, but either term works. And really that mechanism is something that is desperately needed for some of these other use cases. The other thing is that with this type of identity and this credentialing, which in some cases is going to require, with some of the blockchain technology implementations, this key structure, this having this private key to be able to sign things. Think of that also as not only having to be true of an individual, but might be true of a device, might be true of an enterprise. And so there's this whole forward-thinking ID 2020, ID.me, ID.me. There's a lot of standards bodies that are starting to look at this, but this is a very keen area that needs to really have some definitive progress made for a lot of these other solutions to be brought to bear. So when we look at those use cases, there's a couple of things that I think we have to remember, and I'm going to go pretty quickly through this because I do want to leave time for questions. But three things are really important, I think, to get blockchain to really happen at scale. And happen in production, because while we see a lot of these use cases coming to bear, the number that we see in production at scale are still pretty few compared to where we thought we would be if we had looked at this 5 years ago. So the first is standards, the next is interoperability, and then regulatory clarity, especially here in the US, where we're lagging behind in regulatory clarity. So when we talk about standards, right, there are multiple blockchains out there today. There are quite a few different protocols. Some are not even blockchain anymore. There's, you know, Hedera Hashgraph. There's all kinds of different implementations. And what happens is, if you think about this and think about let's think about it from an enterprise standpoint, trying to implement blockchain. And let's say they want to do it for intercompany settlement. They want to use it for HR. They want to use it for their supply chain. They want to use it for a couple of different things. Well, the chances of them integrating into a single blockchain for all of those is very, it's not going to happen, right? And so you have to think about how things are going to happen with different implementations of blockchain. So there are the need for standards, right? What are those ground rules and those best practices that are going to let there be the efficiencies that we need to exist, as opposed to that fragmentation and silos that are happening today in the way these things are implemented, in the way they're regulated, et cetera. The ISO is really the furthest along. They currently have released 4 standards, and they have another 11 under development. So if you're a person who's interested in building something around blockchain, figuring out what the ISO is doing and what these standards are and kind of what they're looking at is good. There are government standards that are being released here in the US. NIST is doing those. They have done standards across a couple of different things. Tokenization is one that they have started to issue guidance on. So they're not quite to standards yet. Encryption, their cryptographic standards come into play here. So their FIPS 140-2 is very relevant to various protocols. And as a matter of fact, we were working on one where the FIPS standard came into play because believe it or not, the standard here in the US is SHA-256, and Ethereum built into it has KSIC 256. And so while they're both equally secure, they're not the same. And so what does that mean when it doesn't meet the standard that the US government has stipulated? So they're just things like that that you've got to be aware of as you're looking at this stuff. On how standards are brought to bear. Interoperability is another big one, but I'm happy to say that there's just been some really cool advancements here on interoperability. But back to, the business that has, 5 different implementations of blockchain, how do you make sure they're talking to one another? How do you make sure that there's the ability to intersect those blockchains at the level they need to be, and especially if you've tokenized something and those tokens need to traverse multiple different protocols. And so thankfully there's things like Polkadot and Cosmos. There's, just a ton of stuff happening. As a matter of fact, Polkadot's going to start their auctions here soon to be able to have those, your blockchain interact with their base blockchain. And I think those are supposed to start in the next couple of months. So there's a lot of motion here. And I think this is key to true implementation and scalability. And then finally, regulatory clarity. And I think I've talked a little bit about this. Their states have actually issued quite a few laws around blockchain. And I think it's to try and fill a vacuum that doesn't, that is there at the federal level, but I'm not sure it doesn't create more confusion at some level. But if you look, there have been multiple different state laws that have been passed. They go anywhere from allowing or disallowing the use of cryptocurrency in buying lotteries to saying that a smart contract can be declared viable as a contract between people. So there's a lot of stuff happening there. I do think that we're going to start to see more out of the Fed. The SEC has been more vocal, the IRS, but there's still fragmentation there, right? The definition even of what some of these things are do not agree across several of the federal level agencies that weigh in on whether these things are securities or they're, assets, et cetera. And so I think, understanding the regulatory landscape of what it is you're trying to do, especially if you're using, crypto assets in any way, shape, or form, or you're issuing tokens is critical. And while it's changing, it's something that you still have to be very aware of. And so I think, that kind of is, the 3 things that I think are super important as we move forward is, understanding the standards and their developments, that interoperability component, and the regulatory landscape as it starts to develop. with that, I will stop talking at you, which I feel very uncomfortable doing, by the way, especially on a Zoom meeting, and answer questions. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Wendy. Let's start off with the first question that we got in here, where it was, do you think that DeFi has the opportunity to change how shares are sold or acquired in the stock market?
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic or question, because as I told you when I was listening to that podcast, I was thinking that stock shares, in fact, could be NFTs, and therefore could be traded exactly like you're saying. The complexity in all of this is, in theory, this all makes great sense. And I'm totally with you from a technological standpoint, definitely something that could be negotiated that way. Where we find turbulence in trying to implement those types of use cases are the pressure that gets put on it from the ecosystems that already exist today, right? So the name's escaping me right now, but the agents that broker, right, the shares today all have a million reasons why this won't work. And that's the battle you start to fight. It's less a technological battle and more an organizational dynamics across the ecosystem. But I do agree with you that that is a very solid use case, not only for DeFi, but for NFTs.
All right. I actually have a question that I wanted to throw out there too. Is I think one of the more interesting things I've heard recently is the idea that like Beeple and some of the like NFTs that have been sold associated with him, and even really with a lot of different types of art, are building into the code a way for artists to be compensated on like secondary sales and things like that. How do you think that like building these kinds of ways that like the financial transaction can move with an asset like an NFT, or potentially that might at some point in time be something like a land deed or a way that like a trust is executed or something like that? What do you think is the potential of actually building kind of certain types of things into the code that might help execute and compensate an artist later on down the line, or kind of remove some of the haziness of something like a land sale?
Yeah, so that's exactly what the NFTs are doing, right? Through the use of the smart contracts, is they can actually carry the entire transactional history of that unique asset, right? You can build that directly, and that's why the use of smart contracts or some type of mechanism like that is so very important in how these things are being created and then tracked over their lifetime, because it does allow, and that goes back to that textbook example of how do you know, I buy a textbook, and we all did this, although I've been out of college for so many years, it's not funny, but we either bought used textbooks, or if we had to buy it new, we definitely sold them at the end of the year. But who got that money, right? Not the publisher and not the author. So I think
Sure.
that answers your question. Maybe it answers your question.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think this explosion is kind of interesting to watch happen, and how much interest is around these types of things. But I think some of the like kind of, I don't know, the more granular aspects of these that may have some true benefits to artists and things like that really have a lot of potential. And I hope that they also are seen by the general public too. And I guess that leads me to a second follow-up question to that is, how do you see the like, what's the appropriate calibration of kind of like things like the craze around NFTs? Like, do you worry that the kitchen's getting a little too hot and there needs to be kind of a pullback as to like how much people are getting excited about this and paying, several $1,000s for a soccer player card on OpenSea and things like that? Seems to just kind of be pervading the markets. Do you think that that's an excellent thing, and just all ways that this spreads out are good, or is there a cooling period where you kind of feel like the tulip craze might die down a bit?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think, well, two things. One is there's some that I think is at a level of absurdity, but if you actually look out at these marketplaces, I don't know if you've gone out on some of the marketplaces, but there's also a lot that's not moving. It's just kind of sitting there. So I think it's already starting to slow down a bit. But to be honest with you, the market, things are going to be valued at what they can be valued at. I think the important thing that's happening here is that people are able to transact directly, and then the person who created the digital asset, the NFT, is actually the one being compensated over time, right? So I can't pay for, I don't know where the money's coming from, to be honest with you, James. I mean, if you go out there and look at what some of these NFTs are selling for, if for those of you that are listening in, if you haven't gone out to some of these marketplaces, you should definitely just go look. And they're cool, don't get me wrong. You can click on them and you get a 3D art image that moves, and it's very, very interesting to look at. But I don't know how many people have $10,000 to spend on that, upwards to a lot more than that for some of these pieces. So but the art world works that way, right? So I think it's going to be interesting. I think it's too early to see how much this is going to stay afloat.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating growth area. I don't mean to discount its potential. I think it's more just a matter of how does it find that appropriate kind of plateau where it might cool down a bit, just so that the technology and some of the things that are kind of heading can catch up a bit. But yeah, I'm excited by the kind of dispersion of this excitement. So
Yeah,
going into a couple of the, go ahead.
No, it's definitely, I mean, just over the last 6 months, it's incredible what's happened.
Sure. So a couple of questions here from the chat. Do you see similarities between this blockchain decentralization era and the .com era and the start of a new internet? And I guess to kind of follow on with that, if so, kind of how does that matter, and what lessons might be gleaned from that?
Yeah, so honestly, I have been at this a long time. And so I think, at the beginning, we saw, so let me address two different things. One is, I am old enough that I was around for the start of the internet, and there was a fight between, what was called DCE and TCP/IP and TCP/IP1, right? And it's a protocol. Blockchain is just a protocol on a layer above that, right? But if you start to think about, well, it was, first static web pages, and then, everybody started to see the art of the possible with the internet. And when we talk about blockchain, everybody had a really hard time at first trying to get their head around what was it besides just Bitcoin, right? And then move towards, okay, here's the art of the possible. There was a big upswing in a couple of different things. One was the development of different protocols, right? And the second was these products, if you will, that were on top of it, right? But it was still much like the .com era, where it was build it and they will come. And I think we've already started to see, not on there's still just a huge proliferation of products out there. And certainly there's a lot of different protocols, which is where that interoperability and standards are going to come in. But I think we're starting to, people are beginning to see that this build it and they will come, it doesn't work. There's a very hard part to blockchain, which is called the network or the consortium. And so there are public blockchains, but then there are also permission blockchains. Nobody has really solved the problem of how to very easily get an ecosystem together in a co-opetition manner in a permission blockchain world. And so I think that also is starting to impact the number of products that are out there that are not getting traction.
Sure. So it looks like we've got a question that's kind of getting an upvote, or at least I'd like to hear that one. So this is questions from uh, KG, and it's, what are your takeaways on leveraging AWS, QLDB, BC, and Azure blockchain services, leaving the larger players to figure out integration, cross communication, etc., rather to develop our own chain technology? Are these cloud services stable and mature enough for the prime time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I love the one about QLDB because I'm becoming more of a fan of QLDB because of what I just said, which is QLDB takes out the network component. And in a lot of cases, what we're seeing is there isn't really the decentralized network being put in that. For example, we were dealing with one industry medical device and they wanted to track the supply chain, but they didn't want anybody else. They just wanted to track their device from the time they built it through its travels to the point at which it was implemented in a hospital or medical office, right? Well, you don't need a blockchain for that, right? QLDB would be great. The thing that's shortcoming, and I'm actually working with AWS, and then also there's a couple of other database that are trying to look at, can they do an append-only database as well? You don't get smart contracts, right? So there's the lack of smart contracts in QLDB and some of these other ones that are coming up. They're append-only, but you can't append a smart contract or get the functionality of a smart contract. So I think that's a huge gap personally, because I'm a huge fan of using smart contracts. When you look at the blockchain as a services, across AWS, Azure, a couple of the other ones, yes, I think that, they are definitely worth looking at. Oracle, AWS, basically only had Hyperledger with a couple of their protocols until just recently. AWS just launched Ethereum, but it's only on their public network. So you can't do permissioned implementations of it. They are maturing pretty quickly. And I think they're definitely worth looking at. Code was, we went from assembler, we started to build, a little bit, you got to Pascal and PL1 and C and C++ and Java, right? We started to come up the chain on making it easier and easier to actually code until we got to the 4GLs, and now we're to no code, low code platforms, which are really great. What we're starting to see with these BaaS or blockchain as a services is they're starting to give us some of that same type of functionality, which I think is huge and definitely worth it. They're definitely at a level of maturity. I think they have a ways to go as well to add more and more features and functions that'll be very helpful.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time here, Wendy. I think we'll close it off at that and try to get wrapped up here. But this is a wonderful discussion, and thank you for taking us through some of the things that are happening in blockchain, where things are heading in the future. And yeah, very exciting discussion.
Thank you. This was great.
All right. And actually, with that, that's the end of Blocksburg 2021. I wish I had some sort of fireworks, or we were all heading out to a happy hour or some sort of thing like that. But I guess that's the nature of the virtual world that we live in here this year. So just a quick recap. I want to thank Wendy, Colonel Regener, the folks at Acceleration and Archive Corps, and also Jose and Cesar from our first panel. It was a great experience. And also, I really want to make sure I highlight thank you to Haley and to Brittany from our engagement team here at the Department of Computer Science for taking care of all of our dark ops, getting everybody signed up and everything taken care of there here today. Thank you each. And with that, I think that's the end of Blocksburg 2021. And thank you all for your attendance. And please reach out if you have any questions or anything. We'll have a recording posted to our website here in the next couple of days of each of these sessions, if you feel like you missed one and you didn't get a chance to check it out. So I encourage you to stay engaged with our work and reach out to me or check in on our website. Thanks a bunch.